I know that last panel was so exciting, that's why we have such a buzz in the room, but this one's gonna be just as exciting, I promise. Because it really ties together what we were trying to convey in the last panel. So we are super excited to be able to have our colleagues from Equal Measure to be able to facilitate this panel for us, and I'm gonna turn it over to Seth.
Thanks very much, Erin. And it's interesting. So, we talk a lot about the power of storytelling, and you hear storytelling, the term used, so often. But I think I just want to say that the conversation that we just had with the 4 students, that's the power of storytelling demonstrated for you front and center right there. So I just, again, wanted to thank the students for sharing their stories and, in such a meaningful and compelling way. So welcome to our session, Strategic Communications and Storytelling to Drive Sustainability. I'm Seth Klukoff. I'm Vice President of Thought Leadership at Equal Measure. Equal Measure is one of the partners in the NSF, includes Coordination Hub, and I serve as one of the co-PIs leading the strategic communications work for us. Yeah. Actually, you can take us back to the introductory slide. The one right after this. Great. So I am thrilled to be joined with my 3 panelists for our session today. We have Dr. Ruth Plenty Sweetgrass She-Kills. Ruth is from the Native Fuse Alliance, and she's the Director of Food Sovereignty at the Nueta Hidatsa Sanish College, which is in North Dakota. We have Dr. Gregory Goins. Greg is the Associate Dean for Agricultural Research at North Carolina A&T State University. And we have Dr. Erica Harvey. Erica is the co-PI from the First 2 Network, one of the first alliances funded by NSF Includes about 5 years ago. And Erica is the Ablina Suarez Visiting Professor of Chemistry, and she's also the Campus Sustainability Consultant for Fairmont State University. So welcome, Ruth, Erica, and Greg to our panel. So just a little bit about the flow of the session. So I will kick us off with just a pretty brief framing presentation about the link between communications, strategic communications, and sustainability. And then we'll turn it off to a conversation with our 3 panelists here, hopefully a very informal conversation. We'll do that for about 25 minutes, and 35 minutes actually, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A from all of you here. So we'd love to hear what your questions are for the panelists. And then we'll go to our breakouts right after this, which will also focus on different aspects of communications and storytelling and sustainability as well. Quick housekeeping note before we get into it. Again, it's communication. So, we have a Twitter account. So if you'd like to view it, participate in it, you can do that. The hashtag is #IncludesConvening as well. So, feel free to use that hashtag as well to join in the online dialogue too. So we have 4 overarching goals for our session. Here, our plenary session, and also these, weave into the workshops as well. And you can see them up here on the screen. So, we'll talk about this more in a couple of moments, but, we'd love for you to start learning about the connections between, communications and organizational strategy and how that kind of ties together with the value of understanding audiences. So we'll talk about that in a moment. You learn about the communications journey from a couple of our includes alliances, First Two and Native Fuse as well, and also by one of our network members with the work that Greg is doing too. And I'll talk about how these communication strategies have been developed, co-created importantly, how they've been resourced, how they've been managed. We'll have an opportunity to talk during our discussion here about equitable storytelling, and we'll share examples of what that looks like in each of their work as well. And then in the workshops that'll follow this session, you'll all have an opportunity to kind of explore and share the value of your work. You'll have an opportunity to workshop different messages and see how they resonate too. So we really want to make the workshops that we do following the plenary really interactive and experiential for you. So let's talk briefly about the link between strategic communications and sustainability. And I think there are two fundamental things to think about when you think about, well, what is that link? One is how do you inspire others to partner with and help fund your work? So communications as a tool to help you do that, to really inspire others to say, hey, I'd like to partner with you, I'd like to fund you, I'd like to join your operation and your organization. I think the second thing to really consider here too is, how are you beginning to shift mindsets or narratives? How are you beginning to shift policies or practices to make sure that your work gets sustained? And so you see, so that I think is like the real inherent value of strategic communications and sustainability. It's being able to do both of those things. And when you go deep in strategic communications, it's all about sharpening and clarifying how you talk about what your work does, why it's important, why, thinking about your audiences, including funders and others, and thinking about why they should support your work. So again, we really believe that strategic communications is a valuable tool to help you think about sustainability. As I mentioned in one of the goals before, I think it's very important to think about strategic communications as an organizational strategy. I think, too often we think about communications as this kind of thing that happens in a box, sort of this mysterious things. People go and they write press releases or they post things on social media or do podcasts or whatever, and word gets out. And it's much more than that. I think when you think about communications sort of as a one-off or a box, you become less effective that way. So I think it's important to think about communications as an integral part of an organizational strategy. And the way to think about that is internally and externally. So internally, and we'll talk about what that means in a few moments, it's important to think about, who are you as an organization, right? What do you do? How do you want to talk about the organization? Why do you want to do that? That really helps you think about, what you do, how you do it, and what your priorities are. So a lot of that gets into audience definition, messaging, thinking about the who, what, when, where, and why. So I think when you do all that work, when you kind of focus on the internal piece first, that makes you much, much more effective for the external piece. When you start talking to external audiences, it'll make you talk more clearly about the work that you do, more compellingly about the work that you do, and ultimately give you more credibility in your voice and in your message. So again, really thinking about two related component parts of strategic communications, internal and external, as a cohesive organizational strategy. It's a very important part of that. So I think there are four questions to think about when you think about strategic communications that ultimately help you make that link to sustainability. I look at these four questions sequentially. I think sometimes there's a tendency to kind of go quick to question 4, right? What do we want to do? What are the tactics going to be? Let's do this cool thing or that cool thing. No, you need to kind of start really at number 1. Who are your audiences? Who do you want to talk to? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. But really nailing down who are my primary audiences, who are my secondary audiences, and kind of really thinking about that first. That's the most important thing to do. Then, okay, you've identified your audiences. what do you want them to do? So starting now to pivot from who the audiences are to thinking about the impact that you have. What do you want them to do? Number 3, why do you want them to do it? What's the why? So you have your audiences, you're thinking about the action. Why is it important? Why is it important for you to develop this communication strategy to share this work? And so then when you've kind of answered question 1 and 2 and 3, then you're in a really good position to address question 4, how you share your messages to inspire action. And that's when you start getting a little more tactically oriented and start thinking, well, maybe we ought to have, one-on-one conversations with legislators. Maybe we ought to think about what is our social media strategy going to be. Maybe we ought to create a media relations campaign and pitch different reporters for articles or op-eds. So the whole host of tactics that you could think about, that's really what question 4 here. And when you've done all of this, when you've kind of done this sequentially, then you're in a real strong position to articulate a clear and cohesive message. And so the work that you're doing here, kind of thinking about the organizational strategy, I think this is the internal work. This is the kind of thinking about what do we want to do, and why. I have 2 more questions to put into the mix here. Lots of questions. So we had the 4 questions that I shared before that are sort of the sequential way to think about your strategic communication strategy to inform sustainability. I think there are 2 governing questions for all of that. First and foremost, what's the what? Why is this important? To whom is this important? So what's the what? And then secondly, what's the so what? Why should the audience care? We could say lots of different things, right? We could spend a lot of time putting together a communication strategy. But if it's not going to resonate with who we're talking to, we kind of need to maybe think about what we've done and kind of rethink audience, rethink messages. So we need to kind of think about what's the so what? Why should they care? And getting back to impact, ideally, what should they do? So I think if you kind of take anything away from our, this quick framing up here, I think it's these 2 really broad questions: what's the what, and what's the so what? And I think you'll see that as we start talking to our panelists, how that sort of kind of woven into the stories that they're going to be sharing. And so now you've answered those 4 questions sequentially. You've been thinking about what's the what, what's the so what, and now we're now starting to pivot from internal to external as we think about communications as an organizational strategy. You're starting to get the results. I mean, yes, you're going to get visibility. That's great, if that's what you want. You're certainly going to get credibility. That's perfect. But what you're ultimately going to get, what that's going to help you get, is what you really want, and that's impact. Ultimately, you want the impact. And so I think this is where we're now talking about the external piece of the communications as an organizational strategy. So just to spend a few moments on audience, we're not going to go into deep detail on this, but the point that I want to make here about audience is that you need to kind of parse out who you're thinking about as the audience. So if you kind of look at the concentric circles here, certainly there are your direct audiences. These are the people that you really want to influence. They directly interact with your project. They could be students, they could be deans, administrators, faculty, others that you're really trying to reach out to. You have your, what I would call, indirect audiences. They're a little bit, a little more distant, but they still have a very strong interest in your work. These might be other administrators in your school. These might be potentially some policy makers. Really depends on the context of your work. The third group out would be, what I would call, your remote audience. They're at a bit of a distance, but they could very well be influenced or could influence your strategy too. And so again, I think of policymakers, other community leaders in that group as examples. And then last but by no means least, you have sort of the societal audience, kind of at a broader macro level. This could be, your university population. This could be the broader community. It could be the general public. And there are certain messages and certain impacts you might want them to have too as part of your strategy. So all of which is to say this is not mutually exclusive. I think as you think about developing your communication strategy, you kind of think about the 4 boxes in question 1, who is your audience? This is where, kind of taking a look at this design here, the concentric circles, I think could really be helpful and try to identify who goes, who's direct, who's indirect, who's remote, and who's societal. And so with that's the framing up presentation piece. Hopefully that was brief. We'll be sharing these slides, I believe, with you after the convening, so you'll have an opportunity to see these, but I saw a number of you, taking photos of these slides as well, which is great. So, and if you have any questions, we can certainly address a lot of that during the Q&A period. But I'm going to pivot from me talking to having our panelists get into the conversation, Ruth, Erica, and Greg. And Ruth, I'm going to start with you. So it'd be great if you could share with our group here, what has been your elevator speech? What has been your set of messages around broadening participation for the work that you do?
Good morning. I would like to start with cultural protocol and excuse myself as I speak before my elders. As a Native American Indigenous woman in the sciences, I sometimes am brought in as someone who's supposedly underrepresented in the sciences, but I also want to acknowledge that my positionality is historically excluded, so I appreciated, and I know this is not quite exactly an elevator speech, the land acknowledgement, which starts to address the genocide of my ancestors as well as our dispossession of the land, which benefited not my people. And I think that's something you've heard from some of the other people who have spoken. And so my work, I feel like, as far as broadening participation, has really become rooted or has been rooted in the responsibility to acknowledge the history of education, especially for Native people, and the various forms of removal or exclusion from these spaces, both in education and sciences, which have been done through a number of different policies, such as boarding schools, such as relocation, and also thinking about being an Indigenous scholar in an institution of higher education, who created those institutions and who did they create those institutions for? Typically not women and typically not Native people. So one of the things that I currently work at a tribal college and university, when we were, as a people, not being served by those existing institutions, we ended up having to create our own institutions. So as an Indigenous woman in the sciences now, my first time in DC was because of the National Science Foundation 20-some years ago as an undergraduate. And there was a lot of the same conversations about how and why to diversify the sciences. We're still having a lot of these same conversations today. And you talk about fatigue, that's a quarter of my life. And we're still in the same place. So thinking about where do I want to go from here, I want to really if I'm trying to broaden participation in sciences, I don't know if my energy is going to be best spent there. You saw that I'm the director of food sovereignty. I'm going to be going into the garden. You want to come participate with me in the garden? You're totally welcome to come join me in the garden. But thinking about bringing it back to the institutions of higher education and partnerships and sciences and being an Indigenous scholar, at your institutions, I would have you think about NAGPRA. Are you NAGPRA compliant? Do you have some of my seeds? So those of you who have Mandan, Hiradza, or Arikara seeds, please contact me. I would love to rematriate those. Also thinking about the braided rivers and dams. I'm a dammed Indian, so Fort Berthold Indian Reservation was dammed. If you want to talk to me about working on dam removal, come talk to me, and I'm totally excited. I'm not tired. I'm totally excited about talking about rematriation. I'm totally excited about talking about dam removal, especially when we think about broadening participation in the sciences, and including not just Indigenous peoples, but our experiences and our knowledges. So I'll stop there with my elevator speech because I got a lot more to share, but I also have other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think, an important thing that you displayed there is really, I think when you articulate your elevator speech, I think it's important to show the passion. And it's important, and I think that, there are the words, but then there's the passion and the energy behind the words. And I think you have to really be able to weave that into how you talk about your work. And so I think, thank you, Ruth, for sharing your thoughts there. Greg, I'm going to turn to you and ask you how you think about using communication strategically to sustain your work. I mentioned the kind of the two imperatives about the link between communications and sustainability before. So how are you using communications in the work that you do? From your standpoint, who are your most important audiences? What do you want to motivate them to do? And what messages are you using for that?
Okay, good morning. And Seth, while I'm talking, can you put up the slide with the concentric circles?
Sure.
Yeah. Again, I'm Greg Goins, and so I know he's like, well, he doesn't have includes. Well, I did, and I was on the 8th floor in Arlington at Stafford Building at NSF when NSF Includes was put together. And includes is naturally ambiguous. It's not prescriptive like STEM or IUs or noise. And so you're often stuck between, in this work, are you trying to prove or improve? Because what does the S stand for NSF? What's the S? Somebody? Science. And there's a method, right? You got a problem, you identify, you collect the data. But includes is very difficult to fit in that very rigid box. Likewise, I love this slide, but for our work in communication, we have to have some visual. But actually, those lines are not very clean, are they? There's railroad tracks, if you're from the South. Do y'all know about being on the wrong side of the railroad tracks? I'm gonna raise my hand, okay? In terms of where the education, the wealth, okay? And there's neighborhoods and heat maps. And North Carolina is particularly a very good example of where all the wealth in North Carolina is in about 4 to 5 counties around the Piedmont. I mean, there might be some things way down over ECU in Eastern North Carolina, but Duke, Carolina, A&T, we're all right there in the center. And so the issue is, what Includes are trying to do in my mind's eye, we're trying to broaden to more vulnerable and at-risk communities. Because there are a lot of communities that does not need Includes. And it's good they take advantage of it. So what we need to do is, instead of looking at the typical STEM project or some regular proposal work, you're not working in a vacuum, okay? So first you got to partner, have a real relationship with other organization, because the lines are not clean. And so therefore you have to have a real relationship to make the community stronger and healthier. And you got to have the mutual understanding and what is the nature of this partnership, okay? And so I read a lot of your proposals about accelerate, support, participate, achieve, coordinate, promote, transform, expanding, all for getting to the collective impact of more broad participation. It's hard work. But what makes it easier is if you understand the communities you're trying to work with and understand they're not a blank slate, okay? And often you're trying to prove anything, you're trying to improve something. Okay, I'm gonna stop right there because I know our time is short. I could go on and on.
We can come back to that, Greg. Thank you. The other thing, too, I would encourage with our panelists here is if you have questions of each other, by all means, feel free to do that, too. But Greg, thank you for that. So, Erica, I'm going to turn to you, and I know that for the work that you're doing at First 2, outreach to elected officials is extremely important. That's a really important component of the communications work that you're doing. So if you could share with us what that looks like for you, right? What's your approach? How has that been working for you?
Well, thank you. I think First 2 is focused on rural first-generation students. It originated in West Virginia and is expanding out from there. We're trying to change systems that would support these students, and particularly in the first 2 years of college, with keeping in mind that student leadership and the lived experience of students is centered in our work. So students are part of the network, they're paid to participate in the network, and they're the key to talking to our legislature, because the students are actually constituents of districts all over the state. And before, it's pretty hard to get time with the education committee or the Senate leader as a faculty member, but if you have students approach their legislators, and I'm here with a contingent, you heard them earlier. Samantha Mitchell is representing one of the co-PI organizations, and she has helped bring students to the legislature and helped prep them to meet with their legislators and really do a whole civics course, because the last time you had that was 8th grade. So we also brought a student with us, and she's going to talk a little bit about her experience at the legislature. And while she's coming up, I'll just tell you that last year there was actually a bill passed to have a more flexible AmeriCorps position, and that was largely from direct voice of students and others to legislators. This AmeriCorps position lets them do part-time while they study, and it's a key to our sustainability, so it's exactly what you were talking about earlier.
Hi, so I'm Abigail Judy. I go to WVU. I'm a first two director now. Thank you, Sam. So basically the process of what we did to go to the Capitol, our state capital, West Virginia, we emailed our representatives, right? I emailed, I believe, 4 of mine, because I'm not originally from Morgantown. I'm from Charleston, West Virginia, so I had a bunch of different people I could email. I will say, this might be a little off topic, but I think it's important on the conversation of strategic communication. We also went the day of the undergraduate research day at our Capitol, which is a bunch of undergraduate students talking about their research. And you would see a crazy amount of politicians just walking by students as they're trying to get them to come over, learn about what they've been researching. WVU is an R1 research institution, and they're just completely ignoring it. But me, I wasn't there to present my research. I was there to harass. And I loved being able to pull them aside and be like, hey, and then you think about it, this is the representative that wants to decrease my water quality. This is the guy that wants to do that. And being able to put it in different language. I think we as scientists tend to use a lot of jargon, use different language that does not, it ends up getting very politicized. I'm environmental science at WVU, and you would not believe what people have said to me when I explain that I just want clean air, clean water, people to survive is bonkers, I know. But that I just want to put is the most important part, and I think that was the most successful. Talking to some of these representatives that you would have thought were the most completely opposite end of the spectrum politically. But when I said, oh, hey, maybe if you think about acid rain and the way that we have to completely redo the gold foil on the top of the Capitol, instead of going, let's take down the coal mines, or whatever political way we're going to say it. Strategic communication, using different language, and also, jargon is bad. Let's not be pretentious, guys.
And as we saw with the student panel, that's why you just let students tell their own stories.
1,000%, Erica. Thank you for that. Abigail, Judy, thank you also for that too. And I would wholeheartedly endorse, yes, jargon is bad, right? Great. So I have a question that I'd like Ruth, Erica, and Greg to ask to all of you. And I mentioned when I was going over the goals, the concept of equitable storytelling. And equitable storytelling is something that's really central to the work of NSF Includes. When we think about who's telling the story? Whose stories are we telling? How are we telling those stories? So I'd love to hear from each of you, how do you think about equitable storytelling? And as part of that, how do you reach out to, some voices that are maybe not where they should be or not part of the conversation? And how do you do that?
Okay, I guess I'll go first. I might not totally answer the question the way it was posed, but so after today, I'm going to head to the Ecological Society of America conference, and I'm meeting up with a bunch of my colleagues, and so I'm super excited about it because there's a bunch of other geeky indigenous scholars that are going to be talking about ecology. And so as we're texting back and forth about, what time do you get in? Which hotel are you at? We also started talking a little tiny bit about, well, what are you working on right now? And one of my indigenous colleagues is currently a postdoc, and she has a manuscript. I think it's been accepted, but she's getting back comments from a very well-known journal, who shall remain nameless, who the paper that the paper is capitalizing on indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledges, and the reviewers are giving a lot of pushback to the way that the indigenous scholars have written this particular piece. And so she's having to then push back. And so just as something to, I guess, a resource for those of you who may be editors or reviewing manuscripts or other things, other writing, Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous peoples by Gregory Younging, written in 2018. So if you want us and you want our knowledge to be included in the sciences, it also needs to be in the literature. And I would say also for us to be able to tell that kind of a story in a way that resonates with our our people. So that's my comment to the question.
Ruth, thank you very much for that. Erica or Greg?
Okay. Well, in the South where I'm from, in the black church, you can be short on scripture and long on sermon. But when it comes to storytelling, you want to be short on both. Okay? Look, so the purpose of the storytelling, especially for the communities I work in on the other side of the railroad tracks, which I love and where I'm from and I return, is you need some things that exist for the story to resonate. So you want to have a story where that helps inspire the beliefs in those populations, the beliefs and the steps your Includes project will invoke. Whatever you're getting a budget, there's going to be steps, there's going to be data collection. So your stories have to inspire, why they should believe this is going to help, okay? Because there's always resistance to change, and that's one thing you need. Then your story needs to find out before you start is just how happy where that group is now. You don't change when you're happy where you're at, but the reason you approach these communities, you realize by talking to them that they're not happy with the level of access their participants have to STEM careers. Okay, so if you have that, that's a great motivation. Okay, sometimes being not happy is a very great motivation to move. Put your hand on a hot iron and see if you want to move. Okay, and then the story, you want to culminate with providing a great vision of what the future of the other side of the hill looks like. Okay, all right, thanks.
I have two short things to say also. In West Virginia, I think that we would probably not start with a story or an elevator speech. I think we'd start by saying, where are you from? Because that's, that's how we connect. And I also think that plain language, like Judy said, and equity in having the other person's thoughts be just as important as yours in that conversation that you're having with them, even if it is a relatively scary legislator. And then I just wanted to, as a cool way, that one of our evaluators is Caitlin Howley, and she came up with the idea of digesting our evaluation reports, which are rich on data and hundreds of pages long, into podcasts. But in true First Two spirit, she did that with students. So students helped make these podcasts, and that really cinched together a lot of stuff into a very approachable way.
Erica, thank you for that. So what I'd like to do now is pivot a little bit and give you an opportunity to ask some questions as well of the panelists, of myself. And then I might have one more closing question for the group here just to kind of wrap things up. But I know we have, I think Matt's going to run the mic in the group out here, so just give him a few moments to set up. Yeah, so if anybody has a question, you can just look for Matt and he'll help you with that.
Dirty mic. How do you all make sure that you're centering the communities with which you're working, their voices in the stories that you're telling?
Anybody can go first.
Yeah. If you're unfamiliar with that community, there's going to be a steeper slope. Okay, and so it's difficult for me to answer that since I'm native to the community where I wrote the includes for. The thing is that to be inclusive, you have to show that the rewards is for the community and not for your tenure track or you got this grant. Okay, and then also you also have to show when you build a relationship that everything is low cost and sustainable for the long duration. You're not just here just because includes exist. Most of the things that are easiest for the projects that you're doing is if something is already existing and you're just trying to improve it. Okay, that's a hard question, but that's the way I see it.
One component of our Native Fuse Alliance is a storytellers component that was actually created after we received the award, and so it was, I would say, largely student-led, and so they're directing a lot of the storytelling coming out of the project. So not just about the alliance itself, but also about the work that they're doing. So I think that's one of the things I've been hearing over the past few days is when things are created by the people, kind of for the people and with the people, is how we ensure that representation, that visibility, that voice is heard, is elevated. And I think it's one thing to be telling a story, and you could tell a story and tell a story and tell a story, but if nobody's listening, so then, you know, it's kind of that bidirectional or multi-directional experience, practice, process.
Similarly, I think our students are, they meet weekly and they synthesize what's happening on their campuses and submit that, and that's what drives our newsletters. We have videos of students, and I realized as you were asking that maybe in our internal communications, it's been more prescriptive and less from the students, and maybe that's it would enrich us to do more of that.
Erica, Greg, Ruth, thank you for that. Greg, do you have a chance to go? Greg, go ahead if you want.
Oh, did I look at? I always look inquisitive like this.
Okay.
But there are sustainable. We're going to talk about sustainability. I don't know if we can get to it, but sustainable things. Like for instance, I haven't applied for inclusion in a while. not bragging, but our discussion network, A&T, and working with the community colleges, corporations are very happy if they see the progress. Like, for instance, for our teachers, now they have a card they can take and to buy supplies at Dollar General and Dollar Tree to go buy supplies. So again, low cost and affordable. That's to us, that's our port of sustainability. So you read my mind. I was thinking about that. I wasn't going to say anything.
Absolutely. So I have another question from the audience here. So what are some techniques for handling pushback in mixed audiences where, quote unquote, outspoken members with vested interests may try to dismiss or downplay the message that might benefit the target community? So I think, if I'm understanding this correctly, how would you work with, folks who you're talking to who might want to kind of push back, or maybe they're not fully on board with what you're trying to share? If you have any experiences, with that type of work.
That's a compliment, because that means you're doing something really good, and you're goring somebody's ox.
Well, in my mind, I automatically thought of, he mentioned I'm from North Dakota, and we got a lot of snow, and I'm thinking about our, so sometimes somebody has to break trail through the snow so others can follow behind, and you think about a bison or a buffalo, and when a storm comes, especially like a winter storm, they walk right into that storm. They walk right straight through, and sometimes, and I can be a wuss, but like I said, I think I'm experiencing some fatigue from having to push through things, and so sometimes I just go around and bypass, whether it's that person or journal or other situations. So I would say either go right on straight through because you have people coming behind you, or just swerve.
All right, the only thing I can think of to say to this is that I think in our project, we've had less of that up front and much more behind the scenes. And in some ways, that's a different challenge to solve.
Thank you for that. So another question from the audience, and I think this is for everybody here. Have you had experience working with, or can you share your experience working with local leaders? I know, Eric, in the work that you did with First Two, of course, you've done that. But local leaders, chambers of commerce, workforce boards, economic development offices or agencies, if you've had that kind of experience, if you could share what that was like and how you sort of approach those different audiences with your strategies.
In those offices, you have to have a champion, because they have forms, and remember we was talking about the S in science, everything's very regimented. Well, we're talking about political and commerce and the offices. It's very stepwise. So you need a champion in those places to help tell the story that way that other people who are not includes understands. So whatever you do, I recommend to find a champion within any of those bodies. That will help a lot.
So our lead of our backbone is actually our Higher Education Policy Commission, which is a governmental organization. And Jade Irving is here, and she's been the program coordinator for that organization, in that organization. And so that meant that some of our communication was done centrally through that office and went out to the state naturally, including excuse me, a glossy quarterly newsletter that frames a lot of messages in a really positive way. And then we also have an industry advisory board, again, coordinated by Jade, that I think the way we've sort of sidestepped giving them a message is that they co-create the message for us and with us about the project, and they recruit other industry folks to come into that board. So I guess cleverly avoiding having to do direct communication.
And then my context is, I think, a lot different than their context because coming from a tribal community, our tribal government and other entities that we engage with are a much different scale, I would say. And so I would say distill down really what are your points and be very concise. So 3 points, 3 sentences. And then I would also agree the importance of relationship, and I've heard that multiple times throughout the past few days, the importance of building the relationships, but then also in a tribal community, I would say that informal communication is also really important.
All right, thank you. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions as far as I can tell here. So I'm just going to pose one final question to the panel, and then we'll wrap. So thinking about the link between strategic communications and sustainability, and thinking about elevator pitches as well and wanting to be kind of concise and compelling, what would each of you, like what piece of advice would each of you want to kind of leave folks here with as you think about that link between communications and sustaining your work?
Measurable impacts, not just impacts, but things that are measurable. Okay? And you're going to have a little bit of your inclusive, both to prove and improve at the same time.
And I think putting resources behind having the people with the lived experience speak the message wherever possible is valuable.
I'm not obviously great at elevator speeches, and this won't necessarily go to sustainability, but sometimes you get out of the elevator and you just keep walking with that person until you're done telling the story. And then as far as sustainability, and this is totally created by an intellectual property of me, so you notice on the bottom of the slides, this does not come from any institution or whatever, but for me, prayer is a big thing, and that's led a lot of the work that I do, and so that's just my own personal piece to all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. So I think we're going to transition. I'd just like to talk about next steps. So as I mentioned before, we're going to have 3 workshops where you'll all have an opportunity to go deeper in a lot of what we've talked about here. And so I'll just kind of go over those workshops and I'll tell you where they are. So the first workshop we have will be led by the STEM Push Alliance, and that'll focus on understanding identity, social location, and positionality to forward racial equity in STEM. And that's going to be in here, in section A here in the ballroom. Our second workshop with the STEM Ops Alliance, focusing on prioritizing the voices and leadership of justice-impacted people, that's also going to be here in the ballroom as well. And then the Equal Measure team will be leading a workshop focusing on crafting your story to drive sustainability. And if you think about the show Shark Tank, that'll be worked into there too. That's going to be upstairs in the mezzanine and in the Ashlon South room as well. So you'll have a 20-minute break to transition to those 3 workshops. I'd love to thank our 3 panelists, Greg, Erica, and Ruth. I thought what you shared today was extraordinarily valuable. And as I mentioned, we'll of course be able to share that slide deck with you too, so you have those as resources for the work that you're going to do and have been doing as well. And then finally, I'd like to extend a really hearty shout out to the communications team that helped work on this strand, the plenary and the workshops. And that would be my 2 colleagues at Equal Measure, Carice Mitch in the back and Carissa Chang Kress. And also Rebecca Valenches from SRI, who was part of the communications committee and played a great role in this as well, too.